It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip for four. But little did they know that their decision to set up camp in the middle of the forest would be the biggest mistake of their lives. The group consisted of Mike, the adventurous leader of the group, his girlfriend and two other friends, Jess and Tom. They had chosen a secluded spot, miles away from civilization. They set up their tents and campfire, ready to spend a peaceful weekend in the great outdoors. But the forest had other plans for them. As night started to fall, the group settled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and chatting about there. They hoped to spend the entire night sitting, taking in the beauty of nature. However, as the night grew darker, a mysterious silence settled over the four. The usual chirping of insects and calls of wildlife stopped, as if the entire forest had come to a standstill. Mike broke the silence. "What's with this strange silence? I mean, when did all the animals go?" Everyone looked about, thinking it was just their imagination. But something felt unnerving about the quiet. They tried to push the thoughts out of their mind and continue to roast the marshmallows. But the silence started to get under their skin. As the night progressed, they heard strange rustling sounds around. On their campsite, a twig snapped here and there and footsteps approached them, but whenever they checked, no one was there. The group pondered if it was their imagination. But deep down, they knew they were not alone. Mike tried to reassure everyone. "It's nothing. Probably just an animal. Don't worry." Jess and Tom exchange worry glass, but they smile back to reassure Mike and his girlfriend. "It's fine, Mike. Like just the sound of the woods." As midnight approached, the group grew increasingly uneasy. They had lost track of time. But they knew the night was becoming blacker than ever. The air grew, and a thick fog rolled in, obstructing visibility. They tried to calm themselves by telling each other ghost stories, but it wasn't helping. Eventually, one by one, the group retired to their respective tents to catch some sleep. But sleep escaped them as they heard strange noises in the woods, whispers in the bushes, and howling cries in the distance. Jess could barely keep her eyes open anymore. She looked over, who is already snoring heavily, and his girlfriend, fast asleep beside. But Tom kept shifting in his tent next to her. Jess groaned and called out to him. "Tom, can you please be quiet? I'm trying to sleep." Tom whispered, "Sorry, Jess. I can't get the sound that's coming from the woods out of my head. It's okay, Tom, let's try to sleep." Maybe it was an animal. The moments later, there was a loud rustle outside, and it didn't sound like an animal. Jess' heart raced. Adam quickly comforted her by saying, "Don't worry, I'm sure it's just the wind." But it wasn't the wind, and the sound grew louder by the second. The group rallied together and stepped outside of their tents to invest. As they emerged from their tent, they noticed that the forest was shrouded in a blanket of. The fire had died down, and the eerie silence had returned, and it was even more unnerving than before. Settling, the group heard the faint sound of chant. It sounded like it was coming from deep in the forest. They weren't sure about what to do, but their curiosity got the best of them, and they decided to investigate the source of the chanting. They walked for what felt like hours, following the sound until they stumbled upon a clear. In the center of the clearing, they saw a ring of bizarre symbols drawn in the dirt. And around the symbols, a group of people were chanting. Jess whispered to Mike, "What the hell is going on here?" Mike replied, "I don't know, but let's get out of here." But it was too late. They had been spotted by the group. Mike tried to explain that they simply got lost, but the group didn't seem to believe at one of the group members. A tall man with a wild look in his eyes stepped forward. He introduced himself as the leader of the group and said that they had stumbled upon a secret gathering of a group that worshiped the forest. He explained that they believed that the forest was alive, with its own will. Annette required sacrifices in order to keep it healthy and peaceful, as they were lost and had seen everything. They too had to choose whether to join their cause or become the next sacrifice. Mike and his friends tried to leave and get back to their campsite, but the group seemed determined to keep them. They began to back away, but the group started to surround them, and the chanting grew louder. They lost all hope of escape. The group continued to close in on. Their eyes glowing with an insane fervor. Suddenly a bolt of lightning struck a tree nearby, and the group freaked out. They stood in shock with their jaws open. As the tree began to crack apart, the group scattered in every direction, screaming. Mike and his friends took advantage of their confusion and ran back to their campsite, hoping to find a way out of the forest. But they were not alone anymore. As they ran, they could hear footsteps and wrestling in the bushes behind them. They could hear breathing and gasping in the quiet of the night. It was as if an army of creatures was advancing on them. They were almost at the campsite, and they could see the fire flickering in the distance when Jess fell down. As she tried to get up, a pair of hands clamped onto her legs, dragging her back into the bushes. She screamed for help, and Mike and Tom rushed back to her aid. But as they reached her, they saw a figure with inhuman features, his eyes glowing bright. In the dark, this thing was dragging just away, its long, bony fingers digging into her skin. Mike and Tom spring into action, fighting with the creature with all of their might. After a fierce struggle, they managed to overpower, but they knew they couldn't stay there any longer. The group packed up their belongings, not caring about what they left behind, and started running as fast as they could, far away from the forest. They never spoke about the incident to anyone, and they never camped again. In the end, they had learned the hard way that the forest was not as peaceful, cheerful and calm as it had seemed. It was full of secrets and mysteries. I need gotten to search for comfort. They had disturbed something that they were not meant to disturb, and they were lucky to have made it out. From that day on, they never looked at the woods the same way again. The moon was high up in the sky, illuminating the dense forest with its eerie glow. The crackling of the campfire was the only sound that could be heard. A group of friends had decided to go camping in the woods to get away from the city for a while, hoping to connect with the great outdoors. Little did they know that this adventure would take a dark. As night descended, they huddled around the fire, enjoying each other's press. They chatted aimlessly about life, love, and everything in between. After a while, one of them, Tom, suggested they take a walk in the woods to take in the natural surroundings. The rest of the group agreed, and they grabbed flashlights, making their way into the woods. Everything was going smoothly, and they were enjoying there. They felt like they were deep in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but towering trees. And they lost track of it as they went deeper into the woods. That's when a sense of unease started to creep over them. The forest was eerily quiet. Not even the sound of chirping crickets could be heard. The wind that had been blowing all day suddenly stopped, adding further to the eerie silence. As they attempted to turn back, they realized that they did not recognize any of their surroundings. Their flashlights showed them nothing but Trey, and there was no discernible path that could lead them back to their camp. Panic, they started to walk, hoping they would come across some landmark that could help them in their way back. It seemed futile, and soon enough they found themselves lost deep in the woods. The fear of spending the night out in the wilderness was enough to put them into a frenzy, and they started to argue about what to do. One of them suggested they continue walking, hoping to find their way back to civilization. The other suggested they tried to set up camp and wait until morning. They debated, but eventually decided to look for a spot to set up camp. Their search led into an open area. With a few scattered trees, they set up their tents and huddled together, hoping they would make it through the night. The fire that they had started slowly died out, and they were left in dark, except for the weak glow of the night was long and misty, and their fears started to give way to intense fat. They tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that they were being watched, but it seemed to intensify with every passing moment. As they settled in, one of them noticed something on the ground, just outside of their tent. It was a strange shape, almost human in form. They laughed nervously, hoping it was just their imagination. However, as time went by, those shapes seemed to move, slowly getting closer to their tent. They tried to stay calm, but their nerves were getting the better of. Suddenly, There was a loud scratching noise at the side of their play. Someone or something was trying to get. Before they could react, a clawed hand broke through and grabbed one of them, pulling them ruthlessly outside. The group was in shock, struggling to keep a hold of their sanity. As they watched their friend being dragged away by the unknown entity, they heard his screams, which was soon drowned out by the overwhelming silence of the forest. They huddled together, holding each other for comfort. They couldn't believe what had just happened. They had never felt so much fear and vulnerability before. They waited until the first light of dawn before they dared to venture out of their tent. Their spirits were low as they surveyed the surroundings, trying to find any sign of their missing friend. But there was none. They noticed strange markings on the forest floor, which seemed to lead to something deeper within the. They followed the mark, trying to stay hopeful. The sun was now high up in the sky, making the forest floor glow with life. The deeper they went, the denser the forest became, making it difficult for them to make any progress. That's when they stumbled upon an old cabin in the heart of the woods. The cabin was run down and had an air of decay around it, but something about it felt. The cabin windows were boarded, and a strong smell filled the air as they stood outside. Despite the strange odor, they went inside and were terrified by what they found on the walls. There were strange markings and symbols seemingly drawn in blood. The floor was covered in strange gooey substances, and the air was thick with an ominous feeling. As they explored the cabin, they found it to be empty, except for a journal that was placed in the middle of the room. The journal was written in an obscure language that they couldn't understand, making it impossible for them to decipher its content. But as they spent more time in the cabin, strange things began to happen. The walls began to vibrate, the temperature in the room fluctuated, and the journal started to radiate a strange energy. It was then that they heard a faint whispering sound coming from the journal, as if the words were being spoken to them. The whispering grew louder until it became a cacophony of sounds, one that was in a language they could decipher. The voice spoke of lost souls, gruesome sacrifices, and the forest. It was the voice of a witch who had been living in the forest for centuries, preying on unsuspecting campers and luring them dim to her cabin. The witch had a special ability to transmute her victims' souls into a source of energy. Was she used to fuel her dark magic and extend her life? They could feel a cold sensation in developing their bodies, making it hard to breathe. The witch's whispers became louder and more intense, and soon it felt like she was standing right beside them. In a moment of clarity, they realized that they had to destroy the journal to play the curse. They burned, and with it the witch's hold over the forest. The air cleared, the walls stopped vibrating, and the sky cleared up. They could see the sun shining through the trees. They made their way back to the campsite, filled with relief and a sense of victory. As they packed their bags, they realized that they had been camping in an area that was cursed. They vowed to never return to the woods, and to warn anyone who would listen about the dangers of the forest. The experience had been life-changing, and they returned home with a newfound appreciation for life. And the things that the adventure had turned into a night, but they were thankful to have made it out alive. As the sun started to set, a group of friends arrived at a secluded area in the woods. They had decided to go camping for the weekend, hoping to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of the city and enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. They set up their tent, built a campfire, and sat around, chatting and enjoying each other's company. The night was calm, and the sound of crickets filled the air. The night progressed, things started to take a turn for the worst. One of the friends had gone into the woods to relieve himself when he suddenly heard a strange noise. It sounded like a twig snapping, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He dismissed it as his imagination and hurried back to the campsite. But when he returned, he noticed that his tent had been ransacked. His sleeping bag had been torn apart, and his clothes had been thrown around. He immediately called out to his friends, and they all rushed over to see what had They were all confused and scared, wondering who could have done it. They checked the surrounding area, but there was no sign of anyone. They decided to stay up and keep watch, hoping to catch whoever was responsible. As the night went on, strange things started to happen. They heard eerie sounds coming from the woods, what's footsteps approaching the camps, and the feeling of being watched never went away. They thought of calling the police, but they were deep in the woods, and there was no cell phone service. The night was long and terrifying. Every time they tried to shut their eyes, they would hear something wrestling around in the bushes. They couldn't tell if it was an animal or a person, but the fear of the unknown was consuming them. The sun finally started to rise, and they were all relieved to have made it through the night. They quickly packed up their belongings, eager to leave the area and never come back, but as they were leaving, they stumbled upon a small cabin, hidden in the woods. The cabin looked abandoned and run down, but they couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been living there. They cautiously approached the cabin and looked through the window, only to find a horrific sight. The inside was covered with bloodstain, and there were signs of struggle everywhere. They stood there in shock, realizing that there was something sinister happening in those woods, and they were lucky to have made it out alive. They ran back to their car and drove away, as fast as they could. As they were driving away, they noticed a man standing in the middle of the road, staring at them. They couldn't make out his face, but they knew he was the one responsible for the horrors they had witnessed. They quickly drove away, never looking back. And they couldn't stop thinking about what had. They tried to rationalize it, thinking it was just a deranged person living in the woods. But as they looked into it more, they found out that the woods were cursed, and that people had gone missing there for years. They couldn't believe it, but they knew that something dark was lurking in those woods, and they were lucky to have made it out alive. They vowed to never go camping in the woods again, and to warn others to stay away from that area. In the end, and they came to realize that deep in the woods, is there a secret that should remain hidden, and adventuring too far could lead to a terrible